Arthur Croft had always been drawn to the echoes of the past, to the weight of history that settled like dust on ancient stones. So when the advertisement for a subterranean guide appeared, detailing tours through the sprawling catacombs beneath the city, he saw not a job, but an opportunity. The pay was surprisingly good, and the solitude of the deep earth appealed to his quiet nature. He pictured himself, a torch-bearer of forgotten tales, leading awe-struck groups through a silent, historical labyrinth. The interview was less formal than he expected. Mr. Silas, the chief administrator of the catacombs, was a gaunt man with eyes like polished granite, perpetually fixed on some distant, unseen point. He sat behind a scarred wooden desk, the air in his small, perpetually dim office heavy with the scent of damp earth and something subtly metallic. He spoke little of history or guiding techniques, focusing instead on a laminated sheet of rules. "These are not suggestions, Mr. Croft," Silas had intoned, his voice raspy. "They are absolute. Your safety and the integrity of the catacombs depend on their unwavering adherence." Arthur had nodded, attributing the man's gravity to the inherent dangers of underground environments, or perhaps a theatrical flair for the historical. His first week was a blend of exhilaration and routine. The catacombs themselves were a marvel, a sprawling network of hand-carved tunnels, vast chambers, and solemn niches stretching for miles beneath the bustling city. The air was cool, perpetually damp, and carried the faint, sweet scent of limestone and decay. Arthur learned the routes, memorized the historical anecdotes, and practiced his spiel, his voice echoing eerily in the vast silence. During the day, with tourists' chatter and the steady beam of his electric lantern, the rules seemed like mere eccentricities. But it was the rules themselves that held a peculiar weight, standing apart from standard safety protocols. Rule 1. Never deviate from the lit route, even if you perceive a voice or a call. Arthur had scoffed inwardly at this, imagining a misplaced tourist or a hallucination. Rule 2. If your lantern flickers and goes out, do not attempt to reignite it immediately. Count slowly to 10 with your eyes closed before trying again. This one felt almost superstitious, a bizarre ritual. Rule 3. If you feel an icy cold, even if your group is nearby, do not turn around and continue walking. He'd attributed this to drafts or localized temperature drops. Rule 4. Do not look directly into any empty niches or crypts, especially those marked with the star symbol. He found this particularly odd, considering the entire point was to observe the catacombs. And finally, Rule 5. After the last tour, ensure the entrance to the Hall of Whispers is securely sealed, even if it appears to be locked. There was no Hall of Whispers on any map he'd seen. During his training, he'd briefly entered a side passage, poorly lit and not part of the standard tour. He'd heard a faint, almost imperceptible sound then, like a sigh carried on a non-existent breeze. He dismissed it as his imagination playing tricks in the deep silence. Now, armed with the laminated rules, he wondered if that fleeting sound had been a subtle, early warning. The catacombs were old, incredibly old. The stories whispered about them above ground rarely touched on anything truly malevolent, more often focusing on forgotten souls and tragic pasts. Yet, the precision of Silas's rules suggested something far more active, something that demanded respect not just for history, but for its inhabitants. Arthur finished his final training patrol alone. The hum of the distant city traffic was completely muted down here, replaced by a profound, echoing silence. He checked his watch. Almost midnight. As he made his way back towards the main entrance, a peculiar chill snaked up his spine, unrelated to the ambient cold. It felt distinct, almost like a presence. He spun around, a jolt of unease passing through him, but saw nothing. Just the flickering beams of his lantern dancing on ancient bones and damp stone. He exhaled slowly, telling himself it was just the eerie quiet, the weight of 1,000 forgotten lives. But the faint, almost imperceptible sound of something like sand or dust shifting just out of his lantern's reach seemed to mock his rational thoughts. It was then a new unsettling chapter of his life truly began. The first rule. The incident on his first solo patrol lingered in Arthur's mind, a subtle discord in the otherwise orderly silence of the catacombs. He rationalized it, of course, attributing the phantom shiver and the unheard scuttle to fatigue and an overactive imagination fueled by the eerie atmosphere. Yet the laminated rules, now memorized, seemed to thrum with a new, almost urgent significance. He found himself rereading them during his breaks, searching for some hidden meaning or a logical explanation for their strict, almost ritualistic nature. A few weeks into his new role, Arthur found himself deeper within the catacombs than usual, leading a small, late-night tour. The group, a quartet of amateur paranormal investigators, hung on his every word, their flashlights dancing across the bone-lined walls. They were heading towards the crypt of the unspoken, a particularly somber chamber known for its profound silence. As they navigated a narrow, winding passage, the air grew noticeably colder, a sharp, biting chill that seemed to emanate from the very stone. Arthur pulled his jacket tighter, his breath misting in the frigid air. "Quite a draft in here, isn't there?" one of the investigators remarked, rubbing his arms. Arthur nodded, but the cold felt different. It wasn't just a draft. It was a localized, intense chill that clung to them, damp and heavy, as if passing through solid rock. He felt it most acutely at his back, a persistent, icy presence that made the hairs on his neck stand on end. He remembered Rule 3. If you feel an icy cold, even if your group is nearby, do not turn around and continue walking. The instruction was clear, and it now felt less like a safety guideline and more like a desperate command. He instinctively sped up his pace, subtly urging the group forward. The cold intensified, almost palpable, pressing against him. He felt a profound urge to spin around, to confront whatever unseen force was causing this unnatural chill. His mind raced, searching for a rational explanation, a hidden vent, a geological anomaly, but the intensity, the sheer presence of the cold, defied simple logic. It felt as though something vast and utterly inhuman was directly behind him, breathing down his neck, its breath of frozen mist. Then he heard it. Faint at first, a whisper carried on the unnatural cold. It was indistinct, like distant murmuring, but it seemed to coalesce, becoming clearer, closer. It sounded like a child's voice, soft and mournful, uttering fragmented, half-formed words. Lost? Where? Alone. The sound seemed to drift from a dark, unlit side passage, one that wasn't on his tour map and clearly fell under Rule 1. Never deviate from the lit route, even if you perceive a voice or a call. His heart hammered against his rib. The voice was innocent, pleading, almost beckoning. It tugged at a primal part of him, the urge to help, to investigate. But the rule, etched into his mind by Mr. Silas's stern voice, screamed in his head. Do not investigate. Do not turn around. Do not deviate. He gripped his lantern tighter, its beam unwavering on the path ahead. The cold pressed harder, and the whispers intensified, twisting into a chorus of faint, desperate pleas. He felt a profound sense of sorrow wash over him, a crushing weight of ancient despair that resonated deep within his own being. It was as if the catacombs themselves were weeping. He resisted the urge to look. He resisted the pull of the voice. He focused solely on the narrow, illuminated path, urging his feet forward. The whispers seemed to crescendo, becoming a discordant symphony of sorrow and longing, swirling behind him, trying to drag him back. He felt a physical strain, as if an invisible tether was pulling on his very soul. He clenched his jaw, squeezing his eyes shut for a split second, forcing himself to walk faster, blindly trusting his feet to carry him away from the sound. Slowly, agonizingly, the whispers began to recede, fading into a profound, ringing silence. The unnatural cold dissipated, replaced by the familiar damp chill of the catacombs. He stumbled forward, reaching the end of the passage, the group oblivious to his internal struggle, still chattering about the eerie draft. He managed a strained smile, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had obeyed. But the emotional torment was immense. The catacombs were not just old stones, they were a repository of suffering, and something within them was desperately trying to connect, to ensnare. He felt profoundly shaken, realizing the rules were far more than safety protocols. They were a barrier against a hungry, unseen presence. Shadows in the niches. The chilling encounter with the pleading whispers left Arthur deeply unsettled. He began his shifts with a heightened sense of awareness, a constant prickle of unease at the back of his neck. The rules were no longer abstract warnings, they were literal instructions for psychological survival. The catacombs, he now understood, were not merely empty tombs, but a living, breathing entity, a vast, predatory landscape designed to break down the living. His patrol route often led him through a section known as the Hall of Awaiting, a long passage lined with thousands of empty niches where, centuries ago, the remains of countless souls had rested before their eventual reburial or removal. Most were just dark, vacant holes in the stone. But a few, perhaps a dozen throughout the entire catacomb system, were marked with a faint, almost invisible symbol, a 5-pointed star etched directly into the stone above the niche. Rule 4 stated, "Do not look directly into any empty niches or crypts, especially those marked with the star symbol." He had always found this rule the most baffling. How could looking at an empty space be dangerous? He'd always assumed it was a bizarre way to prevent guides from staring too long into the darkness, perhaps to avoid accidents or to maintain an air of mystery. But after the whispers, his perspective had shifted. One night, on a solo inspection after the last tour had departed, Arthur found himself in the Hall of Awaiting. The silence was profound, broken only by the drip of moisture from the ceiling and the faint hum of the distant city power grid. He moved methodically, checking the integrity of fences and gates, his lantern beam sweeping over the empty niches. He was careful, intentionally keeping his gaze slightly averted from the star-marked ones. As he passed one particularly large niche, set deeper into the wall than the others and clearly adorned with a faded star, he felt a sudden, inexplicable compulsion to glance. It wasn't a strong urge, just a fleeting curiosity, a slip in his resolve. For a fraction of a second, his gaze drifted, and he caught a distorted glimpse out of his peripheral vision. Within the deep, impenetrable darkness of the niche, something shifted. It wasn't a trick of light or a play of shadows. It was a fleeting, inky blackness that seemed to ripple, to coil, almost like liquid darkness or a plume of smoke within the void. It moved too deliberately, too consciously, to be an optical illusion. And then, as quickly as it appeared, it seemed to recoil, to pull back deeper into the stone, as if startled by his momentary gaze. A profound, chilling dread pressed in on him. He felt a wave of crushing vulnerability, a sense of being utterly helpless and exposed. The air around the niche grew heavy, thick with a cold, cloying scent, like stale ozone mixed with damp, forgotten grave dirt. He heard a faint, almost inaudible scrape from within, a sound that resonated deep in his bones, like stone sliding against stone or painted plaster shifting. He forced himself to walk past the entrance without breaking stride, keeping his gaze fixed straight ahead, towards the path. But out of his peripheral vision, he could not avoid sensing it. The pressure behind his eyes, the feeling of something watching. him, following his every move from the darkness within the niche. He felt a phantom touch on his exposed neck, cold and dry, like dust. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drum against the encroaching silence. He sped up his pace, but the feeling of those unseen, unblinking eyes followed him, lingering on his back long after he had cleared the hole of awaiting. He imagined the coiling darkness, the subtle ripple within the niche. He had violated the spirit of the rule, if not the letter, and the catacombs had responded. He felt a profound sense of being utterly insignificant, a small, fragile entity against something ancient and vast. The experience solidified his terrifying understanding. These niches were not merely empty spaces. They were windows, or perhaps even mouths, into another realm, and whatever lurked behind the star-marked ones was aware, watchful, and deeply malevolent. The rules were a desperate attempt to maintain a fragile barrier, to prevent these entities from fully breaching into his reality. The cold spots. The chilling encounter with the pervasive cold and the spectral whispers left Arthur profoundly changed. The catacombs were no longer just a workplace. They were a battleground for his sanity. He now understood that the rules were literal instructions for survival, each designed to keep him from directly acknowledging or interacting with the entities that inhabited the dark. The memory of those subtly shifting shadows in the niches, the feeling of unblinking eyes watching him, burrowed deeper into his mind. He was constantly scanning the passages, his senses screaming with a heightened awareness that bordered on paranoia. His next shift brought him to a particularly narrow, winding section of the tunnels, often referred to by older guides as the spine, due to its resemblance to a vertebrae. It was here, during a routine evening patrol, that Rule 3 reasserted its chilling presence. If you feel an icy cold, even if your group is nearby, do not turn around and continue walking. He dismissed it initially as a common underground phenomenon, but now the specificity of the rule, the direct command not to turn, filled him with dread. As he traversed the spine, pushing a small equipment cart ahead of him, an intense, localized cold enveloped him. It wasn't the ambient, damp chill of the catacombs. This was a sudden, piercing cold, like stepping into a walk-in freezer on a summer day. It began at his back, a solid, tangible presence that felt like a block of ice pressed against his spine, seeping into his bones. He shivered violently, his breath misting in the frigid air. He immediately stopped, his hand instinctively reaching for the cart. The cold intensified, moving with him, swirling around him, as if something unseen was circling. He heard nothing, but felt an undeniable sensation of proximity, of something vast and utterly inhuman occupying the space directly behind him. He imagined its icy breath on his neck, its unseen form pressing against him. The urge to turn, to confront this presence, was overwhelming, a primal instinct to face the threat. "But, mister?" Silas's gravelly voice echoed in his mind. "Do not turn around." He forced himself to take a deep, shuddering breath, keeping his gaze fixed straight ahead on the small circle of light cast by his lantern. The cold pressed harder, seeming to try and force him to look, to break the rule. He felt phantom hands, cold and clammy, brush against his face, his arms pulling gently at his jacket sleeve. A faint, high-pitched whine like a distant, tortured whisper slowly built in his ears, just at the edge of his hearing. It wasn't the mournful wail from before. This was sharper, more predatory. He began to walk again, slowly at first, then picking up pace, forcing his legs to move despite the paralyzing fear. The cold clung to him, a relentless shroud, and the whine intensified, becoming a cacophony of overlapping, indistinct whispers, incredibly close, swirling around his head. He could smell something foul now, like burning plastic and rotten meat, filling his nostrils, even though the catacombs usually smelled of damp earth and decay. It was a suffocating, putrid odor that seemed to emanate from the very air around him. He gritted his teeth, clenching his fists, fighting against the overwhelming sensory assault. He felt tears stream down his face, hot and stinging against the pervasive cold touches. The fear was immense, but the thought of what might happen if he turned, if he broke the rule, was even more terrifying. He pushed through it, focusing on the simple act of putting one foot in front of the other, moving away from the unseen horror. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the grinding cold began to recede. The whispers subsided, and the foul scent vanished. The catacombs fell silent again, the air returning to its familiar, damp coolness. Arthur stumbled against a damp stone wall, panting, his body trembling uncontrollably. He was utterly drained, his mind raw, but he had obeyed. He had resisted. But the glimpse into the darkness, the contact with whatever inhabited those cold spots, had seared itself into his soul. The catacombs weren't just hungry. They were intelligent, and they were terrifyingly vast. He now understood that the rules were not just about not seeing, but about not acknowledging, about denying the entity's presence, for acknowledgement seemed to grant them power, to pull you deeper into their frigid embrace. The star-marked crypt. The chilling encounter with the pervasive cold and the spectral whispers left Arthur profoundly changed. The catacombs were no longer just a workplace, they were a battleground for his sanity. He now understood that the rules were literal instructions for survival, each designed to keep him from directly acknowledging or interacting with the entities that inhabited the dark. The memory of those subtly shifting shadows in the niches, the feeling of unblinking eyes watching him, burrowed deeper into his mind. He was constantly scanning the passages, his senses screaming with a heightened awareness that bordered on paranoia. He returned to the section of the catacombs that held the star-marked niches with a new sense of grim determination. Rule 4. Do not look directly into any empty niches or crypts, especially those marked with the star symbol, now haunted him. He knew from experience that the star-marked ones held a particular significance, a more potent, unsettling presence than the others. There was one specific crypt that drew him, not empty, but sealed with a heavy, ancient stone slab. Above it, etched deep into the limestone, was a particularly prominent, five-pointed star. He approached it cautiously on his next solo patrol, his flashlight beam cutting through the pervasive gloom. The air around this particular crypt felt heavier, charged with a static electricity that made the fine hairs on his arms stand up. He could hear a low, chilling hum emanating from within, a sound that seemed to vibrate in his teeth, followed by a faint, wet scraping noise, as if something immense was slowly dragging itself across stone. He gripped his lantern, his knuckles white. He dared not look directly into the star-marked crypt, but he allowed his peripheral vision to scan its surface. The ancient stone slab, usually dull and gray, seemed to absorb the light from his lantern, appearing even darker, more impenetrable. He noticed a faint, almost imperceptible shimmer, like heat haze, radiating from the edges of the sealed slab. It wasn't heat, though. It was a cold shimmer, a visual distortion that spoke of immense, contained energy. He remembered the old legends he'd read during his history courses, tales of ancient civilizations that believed certain symbols could bind spirits or seal away malevolent forces. He theorized that these stars were not just markers, but seals, powerful wards meant to contain whatever lurked behind them. The constant hum, the scraping, the cold, it was the sound of something struggling to get out, pressing against its ancient prison. He fought the intense urge to place his hand on the slab, to feel the cold energy directly. He felt a profound sense of morbid curiosity, a desire to understand what was on the other side. As he hesitated, a deep, resonating thump came from within the crypt, a sound that made his blood run cold. It wasn't a natural sound. It was too heavy, too deliberate, like a massive body shifting. the air instantly filled with an overwhelming stench of ozone and damp, stagnant water, mingled with something sickly sweet, like decaying flowers. Arthur stumbled back, tripping over his own feet, his heart hammering against his ribs. The cold intensified, pressing against him, radiating from the star-marked slab. He could almost feel an unseen weight pushing against the stone, a relentless, silent pressure. He forced himself to turn away, to walk back into the known passages, leaving the crypt to its chilling hum and its contained horror. He didn't look back. He couldn't. He had obeyed. But the incident solidified his terrifying realization. The star-marked crypts were not just containing echoes of the past. They were actively holding back something far more ancient and powerful, something that yearned for release. And the rules, particularly Rule 4, were paramount in preventing a catastrophe. The constant sounds and the oppressive presence meant that whatever was behind that star-marked slab was not dormant. It was alive, aware, and constantly testing its ancient prison. He had grazed the surface of a primal fear, a force that existed beyond death, and it had almost pulled him in. The Midnight Seal. The escalating encounters had left Arthur in a constant state of hypervigilance, his nerves frayed, his sleep haunted by whispers and cold touches. The catacombs were no longer just a workplace. They were a vast, insidious trap designed to break his will, to harvest his fear. He felt exposed, vulnerable, knowing that the entities beneath the city knew his presence, sensed his growing dread. As the hours crawled towards midnight on his next shift, a new concern began to gnaw at him. Rule 5. After the last tour, ensure the entrance to the Hall of Whispers is securely sealed, even if it appears to be locked. He had searched the catacomb maps repeatedly, and there was no Hall of Whispers indicated anywhere. He'd assumed it was a colloquial name for a restricted area, perhaps a forgotten section of the archives or a poetic flourish by Mr. Silas. But after all he'd experienced, whispers felt chillingly literal. He was in the main administrative section of the catacombs, a small forgotten area behind the public entrance where old records and ancient artifacts were stored. There, he found an unmarked, heavy wooden door, almost indistinguishable from the stone wall, in a dimly lit, narrow corridor that didn't appear on any of the regular tourist maps. It seemed to lead to nowhere. There was no sign, no name, but an inexplicable pull drew him towards it. He felt an intense, almost magnetic resonance from behind it, a low hum, like a distant, vibrating chord. This had to be the Hall of Whispers. As he approached, a faint, almost melodic humming began to emanate from within the hidden passage, barely audible at first, then growing louder, like a broken music box playing a tune from beyond the grave. The door was, indeed, already closed and appeared to be locked, secured with a heavy, rusted iron bar. He let out a slow, shaky breath. Safe. Then the humming intensified, joined by a soft, almost imperceptible scraping sound, like nails dragging on stone from behind the door. And then, woven into the hum and scrape, a sound that made his blood run cold, the distinct, joyful, yet utterly out of place sound of children's laughter. It was faint, distant, but undeniable, full of a pure, unadulterated joy that felt grotesquely wrong in the oppressive silence of the catacombs. His heart hammered against his ribs. He instinctively remembered Rule 5. Ensure the entrance is securely sealed, even if it appears to be locked. This wasn't just about securing an empty room. He needed to seal it actively. He grabbed the heavy iron bar, which seemed to resist his touch, as if something on the other side was pushing against it. He pulled it firmly, testing the lock. It held. But the humming grew louder, more insistent, and the childlike laughter twisted into a mournful wail, like joy being ripped away, digested. He felt an immense, overwhelming sadness emanating from behind the door, a wave of profound grief, sharp and raw, that resonated with his own lingering regrets. It was a bait, a lure. Something was trying to connect with his deepest loss, to draw him in. He could almost see a faint shimmer, a distortion just below the surface of the door, like an unseen presence swirling. He knew he had to do more than just check the lock. The rules specified securely sealed. With a surge of desperate will, he pushed the heavy bar even further into its latch, a loud clang echoing in the oppressive silence. He then pulled out the heavy, ancient chains that hung beside the door, unused, and wrapped them around the bar and the door frame, securing them with a massive, rusted padlock he found nearby. He pulled the padlock shut with a definitive click. As the padlock clicked into place, the humming abruptly ceased. The laughter and the wail died instantly, replaced by a profound, ringing silence. But then, a distinct, guttural thump resonated from within, followed by a long, mournful sigh that seemed to vibrate through the very stone walls, a sigh of profound disappointment or frustrated hunger. He felt a sudden, intense drop in temperature around the door, a wave of icy cold that passed through him, leaving him shivering uncontrollably. He stumbled back, fighting against the crushing wave of sorrow, against the desperate urge to turn around and investigate the source of the sigh. He had obeyed, but the catacombs had touched him intimately, terrifyingly. It knew his grief. It knew his regrets. And it was using them against him. The Hall of Whispers was not just a name. It was a place where lost emotions were trapped, where something yearned for release. And he had just locked it in. He was profoundly shaken, realizing he was an active participant in a centuries-old containment, a silent war against unseen horrors. Echoes of the past. The profound sadness from the Hall of Whispers lingered, a cold weight in Arthur's chest. He felt exposed, vulnerable. The catacombs were not just feeding on general emotions. They were targeting his specific losses, preying on his deepest regrets. He resumed his patrol, moving like a ghost through the silent, oppressive darkness of the tunnels. Every shadow seemed to hold a hidden threat, every gust of wind a mocking whisper. The rules were no longer just a burden. They were a desperate, thin line between him and whatever lurked in the abyssal dark. As his shift crawled towards dawn, a desperate need for answers gnawed at him. The journal of Bartholomew Finch, the previous watchman mentioned in his orientation file, had been dismissed as a quirky relic, but now it felt like the key. He ventured into the small, rarely used office section near the administrative hub, hoping to find any old records, any personal effects from his predecessor. He found it tucked away in a deep hidden drawer beneath a pile of old tour schedules. A small leather-bound journal, its pages brittle with age, its cover embossed with a faded symbol, a 5-pointed star. He opened it with trembling hands. The handwriting was neat, meticulous at first, then increasingly frantic. The entries were dated from decades ago, charting the experiences of a previous catacomb guide, a man named Bartholomew Finch. July 14th, 1978. The whispers in the spine grew louder tonight. It sounds so real. The children's laughter. I almost went to investigate. Mr. Silas's rules say no, but the pull is strong. August 1st, 1978. The niches marked with the star. Their darkness shifted. I felt their gaze, even with my back turned. They crave acknowledgement. They crave fear. September 5th, 1978. The cold spots are more frequent. They feel like a presence, a breath. It tries to force me to turn. They say these echoes feed on our fear, on our longing. October 10th, 1978. I found my mother's old locket near the Hall of Whispers. How? It's been lost for years. The sadness, it overwhelmed me. They know my grief. They use it as bait. November 2nd, 1978. The power flickered. I followed the count to 10. But the voices, they were in my head. They whispered about soul harvesters, about forgotten promises, about the grand unveiling. Arthur's blood ran cold. Soul harvesters. The grand unveiling. The journal confirmed everything. The rules weren't just for survival, they were part of a larger, sinister containment protocol. The catacombs were a trap, a massive engine designed to generate and capture emotions, a feeding ground for ancient entities. And Bartholomew Finch, he knew too much. He flipped to the last entry. The handwriting was almost illegible, scrawled with desperate urgency. December 1st, 1978. They hunger, the grand unveiling nurse. I understand now, the catacombs, they are a funnel, a collector. The whispers, the cold, the appearances. It's all bait. They want to remember, they want to break free. They spoke of the overseer, the one who binds them. My name is Bartholomew Finch. I can't hold them, they're coming for me. Don't look. Don't look. Don't look. The entry ended abruptly, smeared with what looked like dried tears, or worse. Bartholomew Finch, another predecessor, another victim. Arthur's gaze fell on the date. December 1st, 1978. Decades ago. How many guides had passed through these catacombs, caught in its insidious cycle? And Arthur Croft, he was the next in line. The rules hadn't protected the previous guides. They had merely prolonged their torment, making them unwitting participants in a sinister ritual of containment and consumption. The dawn was breaking above, but for Arthur, the night had just truly begun.